All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight on Sunday, your Memorial weekend. Living your best quarantine life, joining me, learning about your guts, learning about your immune system. I am Dr. Erica Lavella, and this is Primordial Paradigm Part 4. And my disclaimer. While I am a doctor, I am not your doctor. The webinar is for education and information only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding information you heard tonight in this webinar. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking treatment because of something you heard tonight in this webinar. And okay, we're going to do a lot of review because this is the fourth and final one, and I have to hit all the key points that really bring it in all together and why I'm here sharing my story with you. So primordial, which means existing at or from the beginning of time. Microorganisms were the first living creatures on this planet. And as humans, we have evolved these brains and these abilities to process. However, we wouldn't even be us if we didn't have bacteria. And really, bacteria are what perform all of our biochemical processes in the body, from enzymes, neurotransmitters, all of these things that up to till, a couple decades ago, we thought we were superhumans because we had these special abilities. But it turns out these microorganisms have been doing the work behind the scenes the entire time. And then emergence. And remember, an emergent property can appear when several simple entities operate in an environment, forming more complex behaviors as a collective. And going through the first and second webinar series, we learned that these microorganisms live in an ecosystem, and then this ecosystem interacts with us, the host, and via our autonomic nervous system. In part 3, we learned what things occur to our autonomic nervous system and what previous events, memories, instincts can show up for us, and what that means to come into fruition in its interactiveness with our gut microbiome. So emergence, now that you've watched part 2 and part 3, I hope is starting to kind of sink in as this construct of very complex human emotion, human thought, and human physical sensations in our body. And I don't think I've ever defined this for you guys in this entire webinar, but I think it is important to consider the differences between the verbiage used when we talk about the gut microbiome and all these fun scientific translational ideas. So microbiota literally means the microorganisms themselves. And so this is bacteria, viruses, and viruses in the construct of gut microbiome development and interaction are also called bacteriophages. So anyway, keep that just in the back of your mind if you see that word again. And I would imagine in the next, 5-10 years or so, the study of how viruses interact with our gut bacteria is going to really, really take off. And then yeast and parasites. So all these different microorganisms in an ecosystem. And then microbiome, which is what I am always talking about, is this constellation of genetics in these microorganisms themselves. Now, in the 90s or whatever, we discovered DNA, and we discovered technologies that was going to help us map the human genome, right? The Human Genome Project. Literally, medicine thought we were going to have all of our answers solved. We're going to be able to do precision genetic manipulation to reverse disease. Only to our surprise, it's more complicated than that. You can't just splice out genes and expect everything to go away because of a process called epigenetics. And epigenetics is this environmental input, environmental factor that is sort of the next cell cycle, next bacterial generation effects of what's going on in our environment. And I'll kind of start to map that out for you a little bit for the non-science folks in the room. And so, speaking of bacteria and cell cycles, bacteria reproduce very quickly, like really quickly. So there's certain cells in the human body that have a lifespan of 3 days is estimated the lifespan of the gut cell, like the enterocyte. But it's also estimated that a red blood cell will live about 120 days. A liver cell will live about 90 days. The gut cell lives about 20 to 40 minutes. And so within as little as 20 minutes, an entire population of bacteria can have an entirely different genetic expression based on what was going on to its current environment. So this idea that an environment can institute a change in a cell, the way a cell grows, either bacteria themselves or us as humans, is also one of the basis for cancer formation and disease in general. So it's not necessarily our DNA. We might have certain susceptibilities, but then against these bacteria and this bacterial relationship to us as the host. And again, with bacteria populations changing in as quickly as 20 minutes based on our internal chemistry, there's a lot of room for a lot of change to happen very quickly. And so, again, this is really sciencey, but I know I have some scientists here on the webinar. But it's important because these are more newer, novel techniques to analyzing how these gut bacteria and microorganisms interact with us as the host. So metabolomics is literally the analysis of metabolites given from these certain bacteria. And if you remember, a metabolite is a postbiotic. So it's what these bacteria are producing, they're making, and this is something that can be found in the blood or in urine, in saliva, in plasma. And then there's also the study of meta-transcriptomics. And so it's kind of a mouthful, but what this is a study of is this is studying, so we have DNA, which is our genetic code, and then we have RNA. And RNA, similar to DNA, but it's more that like I can turn on a gene or I can turn off a gene. And so now we have this whole new field in science called meta-transcriptomics that literally looks at the speed, accuracy, frequency, the metabolites that are present, and then what are these genetic changes that are then happening after these metabolite changes are present. And these are very new fields and new technologies, so like 2005-ish and present. And so again, I'm obsessed with the gut microbiome. I'm obsessed with just soil microbiome. Many of you may not know, but the same microorganisms that were found on the ocean floor in ocean floor soil samples, core samples, have been found in the human gut. And the human colon is actually known to be the most highest concentration of bacteria on the planet. So, whoa, that's pretty cool. Maybe that's why we have such big brains and we could do such amazing things, huh? There are definitely some microbiologists out there that would argue, yes, evolutionarily, that is a direct link. And I just find it so fascinating. So 90% of all disease is now traced back to disturbances in the gut microbiome. And even those diseases that are known to be genetic and very difficult to reverse, and almost in 100% certainty that the disease process will set in, disturbances or changes, healthy type microbiome versus an unhealthy type microbiome, is linked with the onset of certain diseases or disease severity, which is pretty neat. And bacterial genes outnumber human genes 100 to 1. Yeah, so again, these bacteria are very busy, they're rapidly changing, they're doing all this hard work for our bodies. And while there's greater than 10,000 different species of bacteria in the human, there have been estimated 3 times as many, like exponentially 3 times as many species of viruses that live in the body. And 99.9% of the human genome is shared between human and human. So my DNA is very similar to your DNA, practically identical, right? We're actually very similar to many other mammals like chimpanzees, etc. But we differ greatly in terms of the constellation of bacteria that inhabit our body. And it is rumored or believed that our immune system acts as a sort of attractant, if you will, for bacteria to be to reside, to take up home in our bodies in a way that's mutually beneficial for both us and them. And then we talked a little bit about gut barrier integrity. And so remember, it's not just the bacteria themselves that are mystifying and outrageously awesome, but it's also our tissue and what is going on inside our bodies to help our immune system sort of screen, if you will, and help monitor for these pathogens. Remember, a pathogen is a virus or a bacteria that is known to make somebody sick. And so like E. coli is an example of that. However, when E. coli isn't pissed off, E. coli is also very natural and very normal to inhabit our bodies. So there's an event that triggers E. coli to go from being just a normal bystander in our body to being all of a sudden now triggered to being like really defensive. And then how that affects our immune response. And we'll go into some detail on that today. And then so this gut barrier integrity consists of anatomically distinct places. And remember, our stomach is anatomically distinct from our small intestine, the upper small intestine different from the lower small intestine. There's different anatomical distinct places based on enzyme secretion, or enzymatic secretions, and like pH regulation. But this mucus layer, depicted here by this green kind of fluffy stuff, is really important, and it helps us maintain the integrity of our tight junctions below. And I'll give you a refresher on what tight junctions are, but that's what's holding our gut cells together. And having this thick, healthy mucus layer is just another way to buffer, to keep kind of bad bacteria, maybe heavy metals, pesticides, all the stuff that we know is toxic in our environment, but we can't help but eat anyway. A really healthy mucus layer just is another barrier to really help protect us. And remember, NSAIDs, ibuprofen, Aleve, naproxen, things like that, poke holes in this mucus layer. So gut health tip number 1, stop taking anti-inflammatories. And eat lots of fiber, because when the beneficial gut bacteria, which we have many, you can just assume that most of them are beneficial. When you feed them a diverse and a higher quantity of fiber, whole grains, nuts, seeds, fruits and vegetables, when you eat lots of that stuff, you give these beneficial bacteria the fuel to then make metabolites, butyrate being a very popular and a very beneficial metabolite or short chain fatty acid. Postbiotic, again, all these words are kind of interchangeable, but that gives you a really robust mucus layer and giving you more protection from our toxic environment. And again, so the enterocytes, right? So you have all these little cells, they're just one cell layer thick, and at the tip top, it looks like shag carpet. And if that shag carpet were to be stretched flat, it's surface area. So it's allowing our body to absorb everything that we eat, break it down into a chemical soup, and then absorb kind of one thing at a time. And if you stretch all that shag carpet flat, I've heard estimates of anywhere between 2 tennis courts or an entire football field worth of surface area. And then, so these tight junctions represented here by these little yellow circles, that is a very important factor in helping prevent undigested food particles or even like bacteria from getting across the cell membrane. Because right underneath the cell membrane is your immune system. You have nerve cells there, neurons there, and you even have blood vessels and capillaries right there. So if you get some of this undigested or toxic or even bacteria that normally wouldn't be there, if you get that stuff in the bloodstream, your immune system can start to get pretty reactive, defensive. I think that's a good word. And so the gut tip here is to just eat lots of fermented foods, because when we are ingesting, again, fermented foods typically have more fiber in them. that's like kimchi and sauerkraut. But also those beneficial microbes, you're also ingesting their metabolites, their short chain fatty acids. And often the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium and the Saccharomyces, those types of strains help regulate the pH of the GI tract. And they also help communicate, because remember, they're sentient beings. They communicate via chemical messages to the other bacteria, and they really help keep down inflammation, and they almost act like a binder, and they can help keep some of this toxic stuff in the lumen, help your mucus layers stay handy, and yeah, they're just all around really good for you. So this very busy slide that lights me up inside, we'll be coming back to it again. But so prebiotics, again, this is just a refresher. This is the fiber that you eat. Eat whatever you're eating now, just eat more of it every day. Just be thinking fiber. Where can I get more fiber? Where can I get more fiber? And then these little colorful things here, these little blue lines and these little pink little chain links here, these are representatives of the bacteria themselves. So when they eat the food that you eat, the fiber, not the McDonald's, not the fried chicken, not the soda, not the sugar-free additives and sweeteners, none of that stuff. None of that stuff feeds them. They don't know what that is. That's actually toxic for them. You eat those foods and you're going to have really, really low microbial diversity, and you're not going to have a healthy gut. These foods have evolved with these bacteria have evolved with the earth. They've evolved with the soil. So we have to eat things that grow in soil in order to have a healthy gut. So butyrate, acetate, propanoate, these are those short chain fatty acids, or those metabolites. And then that's just what keeps everything really happy. Prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics. All right, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here, part 4. So the gut-brain axis is bidirectional. Part 2, we learned about the gut, we learned about gut microbes, we learned about birth, we learned about breastfeeding, we learned about all the things that I just mentioned and how that really helps create a healthy internal ecosystem at the gut level. In part 3, we learned about trauma. We learned about the vagus nerve, and we learned about how our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system are there to protect us. But because we're psychological beings with a lot of stuff to worry about, we often can put ourselves into a state of either sympathetic overdrive or freeze and paralysis. And both of those states are not conducive for a healthy gut microbial environment. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how does our stress impact our microbial environment. Julie said hydroponics, question mark. Somebody else asked me about hydroponics. So hydroponics is like a shortcut. Oftentimes, it's liquid fertilizers. So the plants seem to get what they need based off this sort of delivery system, and it's effective, right? This is kind of like a plant hack, if you like that language. But microorganisms themselves are soil born, and there really is a symbiotic relationship there. But that doesn't mean that plants can't get what they need from, liquid content and things like that. And I'm sure there's plenty of microbes that do live in an aqueous environment. Maybe we can get a plug from Mary, I know, with her microbiome study experience. So moving on, I just wanted to refresh your guys' memory again. A lot of what I say is repetitive, but that's because it's so basic and so important. I just don't want anybody to forget about it. So our parasympathetic system, which is absolutely necessary for digestion. We rest, we relax, we digest. Our eyes and our facial expressions we're not angry, we're not frightened, and it again, our facial expressions and our eyes and our ears, all of those things are connected to the vagus nerve going down below the diaphragm and even above the diaphragm. So our heart beats a little more slowly. Again, we're not running, we're not racing, we're not frightened. But more importantly, below the diaphragm, peristalsis and enzymatic secretions get stimulated. So you're going to have gastric acid being stimulated and motility. So the bowel is actually going to empty and coordinate its contractions so that you get your food chewed, churned, mixed, and then digested and absorbed. Our sympathetic system is a little different because it is designed to blunt blood flow entirely away from our digestive system. And in that situation, we have blood flow going to our muscles. We're tense, we're tight. Maybe we're eating while standing up. Maybe we're eating while driving in a car. Again, I'm always going to tie everything back to eating, but doing these things is tricking your nervous system into not preparing for eating a meal. Pupils will dilate so they could take in all the sensory stimuli. Again, you're going to get dry mouth. I don't know if anybody's been really nervous before. Public speaking tends to do this to people, but you just get dry cotton mouth. And everything in your body shifts to a sense of, I need to be prepared to fight or flee. Looks like somebody asked me something. Oh, here we go. Mary, who is our scientist, she said many bacteria live in the ocean, and it's important for carbon cycling in the ocean and related to climate change. Ooh, yeah. So Mary's a microbiome scientist, and I just love it when she can chime in. So yeah, that's kind of going back to what Julie said about hydroponics. So again, there's many environments around the world where, yeah, bacteria have evolved to be in water. Okay, so what happens to our body when we're cool as a cucumber, and then all of a sudden we get stimulated into being on high alert, fight or flight? Homeostasis, again, is this act of coming up to a peak and then being able to get yourself back down. And this is what is the difference between acute stress, or being able to just handle kind of a new stimuli that's causing alarm, and chronic stress. Chronic stress, it's really a time-sensitive phenomenon. And chronic stress usually starts around several minutes, but lasts weeks or more, right? And then trauma. I wanted to define trauma. Again, I am not a psychologist. I'm just a human with my own experience. But trauma, and I'll explain it the way I always thought of it. I always thought of trauma as being something big, bad, and horrible. In part 3, we talked about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And that had everything on there from death, divorce, parent incarcerated, sexual abuse, physical abuse, big, big deals. And I never really felt like a stress reaction, getting anxious about something, worrying about something, losing sleep over something, would be defined as a trauma. And I think that when we use the acute or the post-traumatic stress disorder language to describe war veterans, it really makes like the mundane day-to-day stuff that some of us go through not have a lot of value or weight. And it seems like stuff that we can just disregard. But what I've learned is that trauma, and this is how Peter Levine defines it, is that it's really the inability for our nervous system to get back to homeostasis. So this might be somebody cut us off on our way to work in the morning. Maybe my husband didn't put his dishes in the dishwasher, etc. Like, we can think of a lot of small annoyances that, again, when not addressed or our internal nervous systems aren't addressed, can build up. And because we are psychological beings that love to fret and make up narratives in our own head, we can have a lot of trauma physiology. So it's not the event itself. So I just wanted to say that before moving forward, because it's taken me a little while to kind of come to terms with using the word trauma to describe stress physiology. So What is stress physiology? It is automatic. It happens without us even thinking about it. It can be worry, fear, alarm, unpleasant communication, bodily injury, broken bones, car accidents, need for surgery, loud noises, being chased, hunted, attacked, held down, and then the asterisk of all those terrible early childhood major ACE things, right? So what happens in the brain is I'm going to go over three main stages, and all of this is happening simultaneously. And it's important to recognize that developmentally, as humans, our frontal lobe isn't even fully developed until 25 or so at least. So if you can layer on all these different experiences that happen to you throughout time, consider how developed your nervous system and your brain was to actually process what happened to you. And knowing this now, I think has made me such a better parent, and I'm really grateful for that. So our limbic brain, which is also part of our kind of like reptilian type brain, but that goes off of our past experiences, memory, instincts, and emotion. So this part of our brain is present very, very early in childhood development. And this is how some people can experience traumatic type reactions, like a PTSD type reaction to something that they don't even remember because it could have happened before they had that part of their brain developed for memory, but their body kind of remembers it. And then you have a cortical brain, and this is kind of your thinking brain. And this is the managed fear response based on your frontal lobe development as a form of restraint. And that's why I put that crying, grumpy face up against a brick wall, because the frontal lobe is what develops to let us know that I shouldn't cry in public. It would be wrong of me to throw a tantrum right now at 25 years old, at 16 years old. And sometimes, again, as a parent, my 3-year-old will cry and throw a tantrum, and I'll be like, stop crying, stop. And I think some of us can relate to that. Generationally, these parenting styles, again, we didn't really know better. But oftentimes we were kind of told to stuff things away without necessarily having the brain development to accurately express ourselves. And then you have the hypothalamus, and this is part of the brainstem. The hypothalamus is the direct connection to your vagus nerve, and that's what regulates, do I go into sympathetic response, or do I go into a parasympathetic response based off of this stimuli? And again, I broke it down very slowly, but all of this stuff is happening automatically all the time without us even thinking about it. And that's why I love mindfulness as a practice so much, is because it brings you into thinking about your body in a way that you can clue into, oh, wow, I'm not breathing right now. I'm holding my breath, or I'm hyperventilating, or, now my neck's really tense, or now I have abdominal pain. Now I have nausea, like, nervous stomach. All of these things aren't very specific to a given disease process or even event. They're just specific to emotion and experience of parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system over time. So what is the HPA axis? So the hypothalamus, this part of your brainstem, is always in that it, you're never fully in parasympathetic or fully in sympathetic, if that makes sense. So there's several layers here where, yeah, you can maybe eat while you're standing up and not have any digestive issues. So part of my muscles were active and engaged. I had blood flow there, but I was still able to digest my food. I might be watching a scary movie, and yet I can fall asleep. Those are just examples, but you're never fully in one. It's not all or nothing. You can have, it's like two gas pedals, and at any time they can be both on, they can both be off, or you can be somewhere in between. So a sympathetic stress response, again, that fight or flight, you get a major adrenaline release. And so everything in endocrinology, by the way, is It's like everything's a process or a sequence. So I'm going to kind of walk you through a sequence, but it's very simplified. So the brainstem is like, oh, there's stress. And so from the brainstem, there is something called CRH. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. It's interesting because corticotropin releasing hormone doesn't just come from the brain. It actually comes from several other sites in the body, specifically your gut, which is, again, published literature since 1999, but I never knew this until like a year ago, and it just blows my mind. And of course, your gut makes stress hormone and stress hormone receptors for stress physiology. Your pituitary, which is also part of the midbrain, it's also the pituitary is also responsible for like sex organ function, oxytocin, and other hormonal and like kidney functions and metabolism functions, which is funny, right? Because whenever, not funny, interesting, but whenever we have a lot of stress, thyroid function goes out, reproductive stuff, periods get a little out of whack, people will float in and out of menopause earlier than they should. All of these things are connected. It's not that one thing is supersetting everything. It literally is, how is our nervous system showing up to support us? How are we supporting our nervous system? Stress hormones then release another, again, precursor hormone that then turns into cortisol by the adrenal glands, but it's called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone. So anyway, enough endocrinology. And then your adrenal glands make cortisol. So what happens to CRH and cortisol, that whole pathway? Well, literally almost every tissue in the body has some sort of immune, it's called an epithelial cell, but it's basically like a lining cell, which you have that within your blood vessels, you have that within your gut, and it's like all over these capillaries. So anywhere where there's a immune function or like an immune gland, it just ramps up its production of immune cells. And then there's an increase in this factor called NF-kappa B. And NF-kappa B is just another like immune busting like immune cell. Cytokines are other immune cells notorious for causing fevers, muscle aches, like all of the flu-like symptoms that's being described right now with coronavirus. T1 helper cell response, again, all immune cells. There's a whole army of them. They all have their own function, pros and cons, right? They're not all bad. This is all a response to protect you, because when our adrenaline and cortisol stuff is stimulated, your body thinks are you bleeding out from like a traumatic injury? So I'm going to form clotting molecules to make you clot everywhere. And sadly, we've been hearing in the news that even young people who are COVID positive are dying of strokes. And we've been hearing about the cytokine response, the cytokine storm. Again, this is all very normal cell function when it just gets really overstimulated. When we form blood clots, we can get strokes, we can get heart attacks. NF-kappa B, what it does is it actually turns on like cancer cells. So it makes, if ever there is a cancer, it'll make it grow. It'll make it grow bigger. Autoimmune conditions, etc. And we'll go into that a little more detail if you care. So stress-induced gut barrier dysfunction. Oh, here we go. We have a question. Thank you so much. Okay, Deborah. So could plaques in the blood vessels come from a sequelae of excess cortisol? Indirectly, there would be a factor. So the plaques themselves are not the blood clots. Plaques are they're kind of like, so plaques is where you get like a tear or like a micro tear. So that might be from so stress, like exercise. So sometimes people will get like calcium deposits within their blood vessel wall. And sometimes what happens is they have an event of like high blood pressure where their artery doesn't have the elasticity that it used to. And so it will, and sometimes this is partly genetic, right? Some people are just predisposed to this kind of stuff. Bad diet, etc., lack of exercise, smoking, too much alcohol, all all the things. But some people are more predisposed to have this kind of disease process happen in their blood vessels. So a plaque is where it gets a little, like gets overly stretched, it becomes like a little tear, and then you have other immune cells called fibroblasts and platelets, so yes, adhesive type stuff, but they try to heal this little tear. And so you get this kind of overhealing response, again, a protective mechanism that ultimately ends up clogging, like clogging your artery. And that's a very simplified kind of version. There's a lot of metabolites at play, right? Cholesterol, TMAO is another metabolite that's getting a lot of attention. But yeah, cortisol, excess cortisol is not good. It's not good, and that's what we're here to discuss. Again, 90% of disease is traced to the gut. If it has this effect on the gut, it has similar effects to other cell types throughout the body. So when we have this excess cortisol response, again, above and beyond what is kind of normal. So homeostasis, a normal cortisol spike, occurs every morning when we wake up. Around 4 or 5 a.m., there's a natural peak in cortisol, natural spike in adrenaline hormones. That's what wakes us up from sleep and gets us going. We also have another spike about 12 hours later. And this is the natural kind of ebb and flow and rhythm of our biology. But that which doesn't last more than a few minutes of cortisol, that lingers, has very toxic effects. And this is what it is. Because remember, your body doesn't know the difference between you getting in a car accident and getting your leg chopped off, or you just worrying and getting in arguments with your spouse. Your body doesn't know the difference. So the gut has the largest density of immune cells in the body. And this is called GALT, or gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And now that we know that when CRH is stimulated, all of the lymphocytes in the body just start ramping up production. So stress is actually creating this overactive immune response in your gut. The gut cells plus the bacteria, remember they're sentient beings, the quorum sensing and telesensing abilities, the neuropod cell that reaches up there and actually senses the chemical environment. Everybody knows when you're having excess catecholamines, which is the adrenaline response. The gut cells themselves even have receptors for making the CRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone. So your gut can also be a signaler for your adrenals to make more cortisol. This immune activation causes a mast cell degranulation. Now, this is, again, me trying to tell you exactly what's going on when some of you might not really care, but the mast cell is the, again, it's a good cell, but when it's overstimulated, there's a side effect. But this cell is responsible for helping our body learn allergy, like an allergen, an antigen. It's what releases histamine in response to like seasonal allergies. And so a lot of our medicines are designed to help block histamine. By blocking histamine, you're kind of telling that cell that it can be quiet. It doesn't need to have an effect. But when mast cells get activated, this releases an enzyme. This enzyme is called chymase, and this degrades the tight junction protein. So if we don't have tight junctions, we have a leaky gut. Stress causes leaky gut. We've known this intuitively for a really long time. IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is a nervous system reaction, yet we didn't really have the science or the wherewithal to really explain it. So this tight junction protein study, I believe, was published in 2009. At the end, I have all my references if you care. And so when we have this breaking of the link, breaking of the chain, so to speak, then the tissue underneath, and then again, the epithelium, which is kind of the mucus layer lining of the gut, but also you have an endothelium, so even the lining of our blood vessels. In order for this effect to get into the blood vessels, that is sepsis. Remember I talked about that a while ago, these like telesensing abilities. And again, when the body senses shock, it just, your tendency for these bacteria to get into your bloodstream is so common. But the tissue gets exposed to an overactive immune system. And not only that, but then you have bacteria that normally wouldn't getting through, because they're supposed to be on the inside of our bowel, like in the lumen of our gut, but they're not supposed to be in our tissue. And so this invasion by these bacteria under these stress responses is, again, why I think we're seeing bacteria show up in breast cancer. We're seeing it show up in pancreatic cancer. There's definitely a well-defined link between the gut microbiome and colorectal cancer. And so if we have this really overactive immune system and all of these natural layers and walls and partitions that keep everything running synergistically are broken, then we're going to have a very overactive immune system in response to these, foreign invaders, because they're not human. And so what that does is it actually decreases the amount of diversity in your gut. And the reason for that is because it changes those postbiotic metabolites. The short chain fatty acids don't get produced in harmony. And you have this upregulation, or this like turn on switch, like I just cranked up the dial on inflammation. And when we have that much inflammation, it begets like other inflammation. And then when we have that much inflammation, that's when the genetics, the anyway, that second word I pronounced, metabolome transcriptomics, that's where we're seeing that these environments, this inflammatory environment that was so acutely created, has lasting effects, because within 20 minutes, this entire ecosystem now has an entire new generation that's been exposed to stress physiology. And so now they're pro-inflammatory, more virulent. This is how E. coli can be commensal and then all of a sudden turn into really bad bloody diarrhea. So coming back to my favorite diagram. And really what I wanted to do is, now that I told you that, see if by looking around, it starts to make a little more sense to you. We talked about food, we talked about probiotics, and we talked about the bacteria themselves. We talked about them being happy and healthy and responding to a parasympathetic state, not excess cortisol. You're making all the right short chain fatty acids. Butyrate's getting all the positive attention, but I'm sure we're going to find out pretty soon that acetate and propanoate, kind of like omega-3 fatty acids to omega-6 fatty acids, right? It's not that you need only omega-3 fatty acids, it's that we have an imbalance and we're eating too many omega-6s. But the reality is you need a nice balance between 3s, 6s, 9s. I think there's even 12s now out there, or identified. But anyway, so it's this balance, and then it's the appropriate pH regulation. But when that's broken, again, here kind of being that neuropod cell, if you remember session 2, this representing a broken tight junction. And we have a broken tight junction, IL-10, TGF-B, INF, gamma, interferon. These T helper 1, this is your immune system. Again, we don't care which one's doing what. We just know that they're getting activated. And then this is allergy prevention, because it's assuming this is happening in a good way. But when this breaks and all these things interact, bacteria leaks are crossed, all these guys get very aggressive because they're trying to protect you. Down here at the bottom, they're talking about LPS. LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide, and it is a metabolite that gets made in excess in states of poor pH, poor short chain fatty acids and metabolites. And the presence of LPS is one of those inflammatory markers that just increases the inflammatory cycle all over again. Now, what's the good news? The good news is that by engaging your parasympathetic nervous system, you can actually stop and reverse this whole thing. Oxytocin is one of those hormones that is released from our pituitary, kind of like the CRH and the ACTH. Just as stress is released from our pituitary, so is the opposite of stress. Emotional bonding, safety, security, love, right? All of the really strong parasympathetic emotions and feelings of safety. Once we bring our nervous system back to balance, the tight junction proteins come back and it's like the balance is restored. So, yeah, just another plug for mindfulness. So the physical and psychological stress in rats enhances colonic epithelial permeability via peripheral CRH. This was a study published in 2002. Paul Sanders has tons of literature on this stuff that I just find so fascinating. Him and his team were the ones that discovered that not only can there be systemic effects from the CRH, but also, or the cortisol, but also that the intestinal wall itself has receptors for it and can actually make it for to further feed it. So this is another rat study, right? Everything in gut microbiome research occurs in rats first. And what they did is they studied rats and they would stress them out by putting them in water. Apparently rats hate water. And they would get them to swim. And by having the rats swim in the water, then they would check their blood and they'd find, yep, like corticotropin releasing hormone is, skyrocketing. And then they found that that induced colitis in these mice. They didn't change their diet. They literally had all the right controls. These are gnotobiotic mice, GNO biotic, meaning that they have a sterile environment, rat lab microbiome. Doesn't mean that they don't have any microorganisms. It just means that they have very limited microorganisms. And what else was really interesting by this, and this is that emergent phenomenon of our brain and our psychology and our past experience, is that the rats would then become conditioned, just like Pavlov's dog, conditioned where they would, even just seeing the stress would induce the CRH release and then induce the colitis. So I'm kind of laughing right now because it's the body is just so resilient. It's so smart. It's so wise. And Western medicine's just done a really good job not giving our brain and our emotions any credit for the last couple hundred years. So epigenetics, I'll go into this a little more detail. I guess I wanted to make a slide about it, that meta-transcriptomics. So we have all those adrenaline hormones, again, no homeostasis, causing colitis in our colon or that inflammatory pathway. And then that idea that bacteria reproduce so quickly that in as little as 20 minutes, the entire genome can adapt. And so, yeah, just all those things. And then memory develops from this. And so then changes can be passed on to the next generation of bacteria, which is why, it's just chronic stress just kind of begets chronic stress. So it's important we get our stress figured out. And so what is a healthy gut-brain axis? Well, it's being present and alert to stress. Again, we can't avoid stress. It happens all the time. It happens every day to some degree. But what we can pay attention to is how is our body reacting? Are we breathing? Remember, deep breathing, just that diaphragmatic breathing is what helps bring our heart back into coherence. That heart rate variability is another measure of I am in parasympathetic state. And then chronic response mitigates homeostasis. So we are alerted to something scary or stressful. My heart palpitates, near miss, I'm safe now. I can bring myself back to homeostasis. And when we have parasympathetic response support, we have enhanced digestive function, all the enzymes we need, motilities working for us, and we have a healthy gut barrier integrity. And healthy gut microbiota balance promotes anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, improved gut function, and short-chain fatty acid balance. There has actually been a whole slew of literature that I found in a review paper that came out of UCSD, their Center for Mindfulness. But they did a really gorgeous review entitled Stress and Meditation and Their Effects on the Gut Microbiome. And towards the end of their paper, they highlight all of the literature that documents that return to parasympathetic homeostasis in meditators, what their lifelong or risk factors are for inflammatory states and cancer and high blood pressure, et cetera, just by meditating, lowering all those things. Again, not even taking probiotics, just meditating, just staying in parasympathetic balance. Dramatic effect on all chronic disease. So butyrate, like I said, it's like my new favorite chemical, my favorite metabolite. It has all this awesome research highlighting it. So what butyrate does, and again, in order to have robust levels of butyrate, eat plenty of fiber, lots of diversity of plants, and then make sure that you're not taking medications that are going to interfere with gut balance. And then probiotics. Some people are fasting nowadays, fasting a lot on ketogenic diets. I don't have any criticism of any of that whatsoever. But what can happen is when your body is into ketosis, your ketones can actually be degraded into a form of butyrate. So that's pretty cool. So again, there's many ways to come to a healthy balance. And, I think even some of the ketogenic people and the fasters are even kind of cycling in and out of it, right? Because you always want to support your body. Again, all things in moderation. You can peak to a little bit of stress, which is good for you. It helps build resiliency. But then you also want to make sure you can come back down to homeostasis or pivot if you notice that something you just changed in your lifestyle is now making you stressed in some way, right? Whether it's gut related, nervous system related, et cetera. So just having flexibility and being able to pivot and really attune to your body and what your body needs. So butyrate slows that NF-kappa B pathway, and that's that pathway that is very pro-cancer. And COX-2 inhibition. So COX-2 inhibitors were as big as non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. However, many of them had to be taken off the market because they were causing heart attacks, strokes, things like that. And now that I've done this deep dive here of the literature, now we know why, right? We know why, because all this stuff increases those adhesion molecules leading to blood clots. And neuroplasticity and memory enhancement. Well, this is pretty cool. So neuroplasticity is also probably something worth mentioning here, because while we have these sort of learned sensory stress responses to certain things in our environment, especially if it has remnants of significant, again, trauma in the past, via neuroplasticity, we can literally retrain our brain, retrain our body to react differently to a given stimuli. So neuroplasticity is a fantastic thing, especially when you're trying to change your internal nervous system. And butyrate helps you do it, which is pretty neat. And then, the lack of butyrate in this dysbiosis and leaky gut, the elevated LPS, lipopolysaccharide, has been linked to all of the neurodegenerative diseases. In fact, autism disorder is now being experimented as far as treatment goes. Young children are getting fecal transplants, and what they're seeing is dramatic improvements in their overall kind of symptom picture and nervous system function, engagement, right? To be verbal or not verbal, to express yourself, to have emotions, to make eye contact. A stool transplant is proving to be beneficial. T cell suppression, which lowers the overall immune reaction, reducing vulnerability to infections and illness. Anti-proliferation, reduce tumor growth, and healthy tissues prevail. And improve gut barrier and brain barrier function, which increases mucin production, mucin being the mucus layer of your gut. So butyrate is a direct link to having healthy mucin there, and which helps trap pathogens in your gut. So whether you're doing it through fasting, ketosis, or eating lots and lots and lots of fiber, just know that butyrate is a very beneficial thing. And so just to kind of wrap this up and start thinking about things, again, from a big system view, our perception of stress can trigger physiologic changes, not only from the gut to the brain, but also from the brain to the gut. And our early development shapes our resilience in and out of stress physiology. So peaking and then finding homeostasis. And that not only has effects on our gut microbiota, but we also have that developmental learned response. And again, trauma in the context of just not finding homeostasis soon enough, and what the attunement effects means. And now attunement, it's funny, attunement is a word that has been brought to my attention more and more and more recently. But what attunement is, and it doesn't show up, it actually shows up wrong on my spell check. So I don't know if it's really in a dictionary, or at least a modern one, but a lot of psychologists are using this to mean almost like empathic, being so present with your body that you attune to your own needs, to your own nervous system, but then also kind of attune to others around you. And it is one of my big, hairy, audacious goals, that I can help teach and facilitate what it means to find that within ourselves, so that we can go around the world and helping others attune to their nervous systems and forgetting all of their gut troubles and chronic diseases, because it's too simple of a process. Like, nature is just a very beautiful, beautiful process. So do you guys remember, maybe you don't, but in the very first webinar, I showed with you all the things we're going to be talking about, where we're kind of going to be going. So gut microbiome, remember, development, so the mother's health and even the grandmother's health. There has been literature suggesting that what happens in one generation because of these epigenetic changes, again, the gut bacteria can change so quickly, and then if it's chronically changed that way, then it's going to be in your offspring's DNA. Birth mode, C-section, vaginal, and then feeding, early life feeding, breast milk just being amazing for helping build up a healthy gut, and then early medications, and then dietary exposures. As a clinician, I've heard stories of parents putting sugary cereal in babies' bottles, soda in baby bottles. Yeah. So again, not to assume that everybody knows what a healthy diet is, but that is not a healthy diet, I am afraid. If you have any dietary questions, by the way, I'd be more than happy to ask them. But hopefully you're getting my theme: eat real food, mostly plants, right? That's a quote from Michael Pollan. And then the nervous system development. So prenatal stress, what happens when you're pregnant? What happens before you were pregnant? How does that information then get imprinted because of these neurotransmitter chemistry? And then there's that word again, attunement. And when we're a little infant, we're attuned to only mom and only a loving caregiver. And we need her smooth, prosodic voice, and we need her warm heart, and we need her cuddles, and we need those smiles and those eye contact. That's where we really start laying in the foundations of this type of behavior. Is it starts really, really, really early. And we do mirroring. In fact, it's called a mirror neuron, but basically the baby just tries to copy you. And think about that through the rest of your life. Your kids are always, where do they get that first? All their mannerisms, the way they say certain words. They're watching us very, very closely without even, again, it's automatic. ACEs, and then also what happens to us as adults. Other, trauma. Again, trauma, it's all the things. It's whatever drives us to a cortisol response that we have a harder time getting back down to homeostasis. And for some people, you can have layers of events. And every time you layer on a new event, it gets a lot harder to kind of peel back the layers of homeostasis as well. And then just the difference here between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Remember, social engagement is such a big part of us being humans. And oxytocin being the antidote to stress, which I just love that. So this is an exercise that I created in reflecting on my own trauma, my own gut health experience, and just how it all unfolded. Remember, all this literature is here. What brought me to do this is that it's kind of my life story. And I shared with you a little bit in part one, and I'm going to get vulnerable and just do it here again in a little more detail. So I'll go through as if I was myself. So maternal fetal bonding, or I think that went pretty well for me. However, my parents were young, very young, and young parents don't always know what they're doing. Maybe they didn't find out they were pregnant in time. I don't know, but anyway, they were young people, and their relationship didn't last very long. So while I was born by vaginal delivery, this was the 80s. I probably wasn't breastfed for very long, maybe just a couple months. I did get good skin to skin with my mom. However, she reports being so nervous at the age of 21, having her first baby, she was drugged to all get out. She was so tired, so groggy, she couldn't even hold me. And this was a time also in gynecology or obstetrics where newborn babies spent time in the nursery. So I didn't get to be held by my mom. No nervous system regulation. There's studies now actually mirroring infants' heartbeat with mother's heartbeat as they start to separate, and that lack of coherence is very, very prevalent. I didn't have a cord around my neck. I didn't have forceps. I didn't have to be resuscitated, right? So I didn't fear for my life. I didn't get that attunement. I didn't get that bonding. And again, research is showing that it's incredibly important for that social engagement part of our nervous system. And then I'll tell you what, I know our diet wasn't very good growing up because we didn't have a lot of money. And we also my mom and my, dad at the time didn't have a lot of education. So I grew up on fast food. I ate mac and cheese with hot dogs. I think that was like my favorite food, all the sugary cereal, all the soda. We didn't know anything about nutrition, and it was cheap and I liked it, right? So that actually represents most of my childhood and even into teenage years. Remember, I didn't take my first nutrition class until I was in college. I was 19. I didn't even know what a nectarine was before I went to college. So a lot of my food was, bagel bites, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, like really no fiber. Everything was sugared or flavored. If I had yogurt, it was Yoplait, which is now one of my least favorite brands. And then, think about when I was an infant and a toddler, this is where my trauma that showed up for me later in life actually occurred. And now it's so easy for me to talk about and so easy to see the link. But tell you what, when I was going through it all firsthand, I had no idea what was going on with me. I just felt sheer terror. But so my parents divorced. And when you have a separation like that, especially when you're really, really young, then it develops into attachment issues and attachment trauma. And so, went on through childhood, pretty healthy kid, didn't have any major surgeries or anything like that. Was outside all the time, played with horses, always in the dirt. Like I had that very healthy, quintessential childhood and upbringing. Teenage years, really psychologically for me, everything shifted when I started taking birth control pills. Started having a lot of kind of depressive, anxious thoughts, memories, dreams, moodiness. A lot of people just blame that on being a teenager, maybe, but there were definitely abrupt changes in my body. As I went on through college and started becoming a young woman, started dating, that's when love and attachment and all of these things kind of started happening, but again, without me realizing it or recognizing it. And I told you I ended up going to medical school so I could be a preventative medicine doctor. And in the midst of all of that stress and anxiety of needing to perform, I also found myself again in other relationship issues all around this idea of attachment and lack of worthiness. And I'm not going to go into that because, again, I'm not a psychologist. Um, but in order for me to really heal, move on, have a healthy gut, have a healthy body, have a healthy relationship. I married the love of my life. I am no longer a passive aggressive person. I show up assertive in my needs, but also empathetically holding space for all of my partner's needs. Um, I share all of this with you because I know each one of you has your own layers to the events that happen to you in your life. And knowing all of the ways that we can be affected um, beyond just what we eat, I think is really important to start to plant the seeds of how do you heal your own gut issues. And this can be for being overweight, having chronic pain, wanting to be preventative, which is my favorite way to be. But how do we react to stress, and how do we find homeostasis? And do we even recognize when we're in stress? Do we even recognize when we're in a stress response? And now that I know that my stress is so intimately related to my gut issues, I've definitely mastered the dietary aspect to a large degree. I feel really good about that. I know what to eat. I do it most of the time. I still like to have fun. Still like pizza. Who doesn't? I'm a sourdough bread maker. I like my wine. My husband's a winemaker. So life should be pleasurable and bring us sweetness. And I just really wanted to, again, share my story with you and let you know that you are not alone, and that all of these factors that have ever happened to you are all converging right now on your neurosensory experience, giving you information about safety and about, can I rest? Can I relax? Can I digest my food? And in doing so, our nervous system does the opposite of stress, which is that of healing and regeneration and alert attention, right? Without being overworked. So, like I said, mindfulness absolutely heals the gut. These are all the ways that I like to practice mindfulness visually. So I've learned a technique about orienting. And so, as mammals who have eyes and have ears, one of the first ways we can really just get present in our body is to just literally look intently what's around you. And you look at what's around you and you name it. And I learned this technique from Irene Lyon. And Irene Lyon gets an honorable mention from me tonight. She is a wonderful ambassador for nervous system health. You can find her online, Irene, and Lyon is Lyon. She has an amazing YouTube channel, and she does a lot of this nervous system work. But so orienting, literally sitting and naming things that you see. And it sounds silly, but it's actually an incredibly profound practice at getting you really familiar with your environment so that you can feel safe. Kinesthetic, sensing your body, maybe even touching your hands, looking at your hands, touching your knees, feeling your feet on the ground, feeling your feet on your chair. And then listening. So just listening to your thoughts, paying attention to them. Gosh, what's the theme here? I sound very self-sabotaging. I sound very insecure. I sound very angry. What are the themes? Am I planning? Am I projecting? Am I stuck in the past? All of these things. Again, just paying attention to them, because your body is very wise, and once you start paying attention, you'll start figuring out what you need to do for you. Stress, can even just acknowledge when you're feeling stress, and then ease. Once you feel that come on, that stress physiology, that need to fight or flight, Can you teach your brain if it's a real threat or not? Because sometimes you have to fight, right? Or you have to flee. So by all means, don't sit and kumbaya your way into a bad situation. We have these things here for a reason. So if you need to defend yourself or run away, please do. But if it's not a real threat and you know that, see if you can't do these things and help teach your brain that you're safe. And that's that neuroplasticity piece. That's how you'll start building this muscle memory. And then emote. Sometimes we just got to get our feelings out. I'm always telling my daughter this, who's on the brink of almost 4. And yeah, it's just very expressive with her emotions. She's always wanting to, get her feelings out. But the beautiful thing about a 4-year-old is that they don't have a frontal lobe and they can get all of it out. And then they can just flip a switch and be back to themselves because they didn't hold on to it and stew on it for hours later. I think it's a very beautiful thing that they have. Connect, practice empathy and reaching out to others because, again, we're all so similar. And attention. What do you notice in your body? And then gratitude. Some of you are on my email list. Oh, this picture didn't show up. That's too bad. That's too bad. I had a very beautiful picture. But some of you were on my email list, and I spent 6 hours meditating yesterday for the first time, which was really, really wild and beautiful. So I hope you got a lot out of this. I'd be curious to know your thoughts, impressions, and ideas, and be happy to answer any questions. Looks like somebody here chatted to me. Okay, all right. Here's a question here from Kathleen. Does that mean it is better to have salad after French fries because the happy salad will help make happy gut bacteria in the gut last? This is why Europeans are perhaps have more balanced gut and are thinner. Laugh out loud. Culturally, Europeans relax so much more in meals in general. Also, culturally, Europeans just have much better food. So everything I said tonight, I want to be held in regard for healthy food ecosystems, knowing where your food comes from, supporting local farmers, eating organic when you can, because America does have a very broken food system. And I know a lot of people who are from Europe and they come to America and they try to drink our milk or they try to eat our bread from the store, right? So not your artisan bread and not your local dairy farmer, but the stuff that's been pasteurized and held on the shelf for a really long time, and the quick rising yeast, and the only varietal of wheat that grows throughout the whole middle of the country that's just sprayed in glyphosate. We have to be little food ambassadors here in this country. I was in Spain a couple of years ago, and I noticed how every single township had little greenhouses and farms right on the outskirt. And you would go in to your little grocery store, and without even having to advertise or have it be an extraordinary price, it was just the bakery or the produce, and it was all, you could just tell it was all like artisanal. So yeah, I hope that, I know where we live, or where I live here in Corvallis, we have a gorgeous artisanal farming community where we have fantastic soil and fantastic energy of people around us that really love and care for the land. So yeah, that's my thought about that. And then here's a comment from Julie. I have loved this telling lots of folks. I'm grateful for your passion because I get all this good stuff. Julie, thank you so much for getting it. Yes, you do get it. You do get it. Yes, absolutely. Well, if that's everything, I don't want to keep you here all night. Julie says regenerative agriculture and food revolution network. Yes, absolutely. And permaculture and biodynamics and the merriment of all of the above. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty neat. Kathleen, thank you so much. This has been jam-packed with incredible information and inspiring. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm so glad you were here. Yeah. So since I still have a few of you here online with me, I would like to pitch this to you. I was thinking it would be very fun, but also another way for me to kind of keep the content going without having to do the same webinar over and over. If any of you would like to volunteer, I would love to get you on a Zoom call one-on-one. We could even potentially toy with doing a small group. But I would love to have sort of like an interview where I ask you about your experience, your interpretation of the information, and then how this kind of thinking. And again, if anybody's brave enough to get a little vulnerable with that timeline activity, um, I would be so grateful. Um, yeah, but I'll send out an email for that, and we can go from there. Erin says thank you. Mary says thank you, and Julie says I'm in. Oh, yay! Good, 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 good. Well, thank you guys, and happy Memorial Day. I hope you guys all get to do something meaningful, and we'll stay in touch, huh? I think you all are on my email list. I'll send up a little follow-up one and try to, hi Lizzie, and try to solicit your participation. All right, bye everyone. Thank you so much.